The bank didn't hesitate when they called me that morning, their tone calm and professional, as if they were simply confirming something routine, but the words they used didn't belong to my reality at all, because according to their system, I had just finalized a mortgage on a property I had never seen. Never visited and never even considered purchasing, and at first I assumed it was a mistake, the kind of minor confusion that happens in large institutions where names sometimes overlap and records get mixed. But that assumption didn't last long, because they began verifying my identity with precise details, my full legal name, my date of birth, my financial profile. Everything matched perfectly, and suddenly this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was something deliberate, something executed with precision. And the most disturbing part wasn't that someone used my name. It was that they used it without triggering any warning, without raising suspicion, as if they didn't just pretend to be me, but actually understood me well enough to move through the system as me. I tried to stay composed as I asked the bank representative to walk me through every step of the process, hoping that somewhere along the timeline I would find a flaw, a delay, a hesitation that would prove this wasn't legitimate. But the more details they provided, the worse the situation became, because every stage of the approval had been completed smoothly. Identity verification passed instantly, signatures validated without issue. And even the behavioral checks that are designed to detect unusual activity had shown nothing out of place, which meant whoever did this didn't hack anything or break into the system. They simply operated within it with complete confidence. And that realization shifted everything from a technical problem into something deeply personal, because it suggested that the person behind this act had more than just access to my documents. They had insight into my patterns, my responses, my habits, and the way I interact with systems. And that level of understanding doesn't come from strangers. It comes from proximity, from time, from trust, slowly built and then quietly used. When I finally asked for the property address, I wasn't prepared for the reaction it would trigger, because the moment the agent spoke the location out loud, a memory surfaced instantly, clear and undeniable. It was the same house my daughter had mentioned weeks ago during what I believed was a normal conversation. She had described it with excitement, talking about how perfect it felt, how it matched everything she had been looking for. And I remember advising her to slow down, to think carefully before making such a significant decision, because buying a house isn't just about emotion, it's about responsibility, and she agreed so easily, so calmly, that I never questioned her intentions or considered that there might be something more behind her words. But now, standing there with the bank confirming that the property was legally tied to my name, the connection became impossible to ignore, because this wasn't coincidence, it was alignment. Deliberate and precise, and the silence that followed, that realization carried more weight than anything the bank could have explained. I didn't confront her immediately, because reacting too quickly would only lead to surface-level answers. And I needed to understand the depth of what had happened before facing the person behind it. So instead, I continued questioning the bank, requesting access to every document, every signature, every recorded interaction. And what I found was more unsettling than any single detail could have been, because everything was flawless. There were no inconsistencies, no signs of forced access, no irregular behavior patterns. It all looked exactly like something I would have done myself. Which meant this wasn't just about someone using my identity, it was about someone replicating it so accurately that even systems designed to detect fraud accepted it without hesitation, and that realization changed the nature of the situation entirely, because now it wasn't just about financial risk. It was about the idea that someone close to me had studied my behavior over time, understood it deeply, and then used that understanding to move through processes that should have been secure. And the more I thought about it, the more one possibility became unavoidable. No matter how much I didn't want to accept it, there is a moment when suspicion stops being abstract and starts becoming something real, something that sits heavily in your mind and refuses to leave, and I was standing exactly in that moment, trying to balance logic with instinct. Trying to find an explanation that didn't point towards someone I trusted, but the evidence didn't support any alternative. It kept narrowing down to a single conclusion, one that felt uncomfortable, not because it was unlikely, but because it was too likely. And that's what made it dangerous, because trust is not built with security measures. It's built with time, with shared experiences, with the assumption that certain lines will never be crossed. And when those lines are crossed, it doesn't just create a problem, it creates a shift in perception. A realization that what you believe to be stable can actually be manipulated. And that's what I was beginning to understand, that this situation wasn't just exposing a financial action, it was exposing a deeper issue, one that couldn't be resolved with a simple conversation or explanation. I decided to visit the property without informing her, because I needed to see the reality, without preparation, without giving anyone time to adjust their behavior. And as I drove toward the location, there was a strange sense of calm that didn't match the situation. The kind of calm that comes when you already know what you're about to find, but still hope even slightly that you're wrong. And when I arrived, the house looked exactly as she had described it, well-maintained, structured, almost inviting. But what stood out immediately was the presence of life inside it. Lights on subtle movement behind the curtains, signs that someone wasn't just visiting, but living there. And when I noticed the car parked outside one, I recognized instantly the final layer of doubt disappeared completely, because at that point it wasn't about verifying information anymore. It was about accepting a reality that had already been confirmed through every possible angle. I stood outside for longer than I expected, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood that the moment I stepped forward, everything would change. Not just the situation, but the relationship behind it, because this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be clarified. This was a decision that had been made and executed without my knowledge, and that meant the conversation that was about to happen wouldn't be about discovering the truth. It would be about confronting it. And as I watched the house in silence, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't done in panic or desperation, it was done with confidence, which meant the person behind it believed they could manage the consequences. Believed they had control over the situation even if it was exposed, and that thought shifted everything, because it suggested that this wasn't just about taking something, it was about believing they had the right to do it. When the door finally opened and she stepped outside, everything happened in a moment that felt stretched beyond time, her expression changing instantly as she saw me standing there, and in that single reaction I saw recognition, not confusion, not surprise, but awareness. The kind that comes when someone realizes that something hidden has just come into the open, and in that moment no words were needed to confirm what had already been established, because the truth was no longer in documents or bank records. It was right there between us, visible and undeniable. And, as we stood facing each other in silence, I realized that this situation had moved beyond questions of how or why. It had become something else, entirely. Something that would not only define what happened next, but also redefine the way I understood trust control, and the boundaries that exist between them. For a few seconds neither of us spoke, and that silence carried more weight than any accusation I could have made, because everything that needed to be understood was already visible in her reaction, in the way her posture stiffened and her expression shifted from calm to calculated, as if she was quickly deciding which version of the truth to present. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't going to be a simple explanation or an emotional apology. This was going to be controlled, measured, carefully delivered, and that alone confirmed something deeper. That she had thought about this moment before she had considered the possibility of being confronted, and prepared herself for it. Which meant this situation wasn't just about a decision made in the moment. It was something that had been built over time with awareness of the risks, and that understanding changed the way I approached her, because I wasn't speaking to someone who made a mistake. I was speaking to someone who made a plan and followed through with it. I finally broke the silence with a question that seemed simple on the surface but carried everything behind it. Asking her how this house ended up under my name, and the way she responded told me more than the words themselves, because she didn't answer immediately. She paused just long enough to structure her explanation, choosing each sentence carefully. starting with partial truths before moving towards something closer to honesty, explaining that she needed the house quickly, that opportunities like this don't wait, that she intended to tell me once everything was secured. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't about urgency or necessity. It was about certainty. She believed she could handle the situation without involving me. She believed she had enough control over the process to complete it without consequences. And that belief was more revealing than any justification she could offer. As she continued explaining, I began to notice something unsettling in the way she described the process, not as something risky or uncertain, but as something almost routine. As if she had moved through each step with confidence, understanding exactly what was required and how to provide it. And when I asked her directly how she managed to pass every verification step without triggering suspicion, her answer was simple but deeply disturbing. She said she used what she already had: documents I had shared over time, information I had given without hesitation, small details that seemed harmless individually but became powerful when combined, and in that moment I realized that this wasn't about her finding a way into the system. It was about me unknowingly giving her the tools to move through it, and that realization shifted part of the responsibility back onto me in a way I wasn't prepared to accept. There is a difference between access and understanding, and what made this situation so complex was that she had both. She didn't just have my information, she knew how to use it effectively, how to present it in a way that matched my usual patterns, how to respond to verification questions in a way that aligned with my behavior, and that level of accuracy doesn't come from guessing, it comes from observation over time. From paying attention to details most people ignore, and as I listened to her describe the process, I began to understand that this wasn't something she decided overnight. This was something she had been capable of for a long time. She just chose when to act on it, and that choice, the timing of it, was what made everything feel more intentional than accidental. I asked her why she didn't come to me directly, why she chose to do all of this without a conversation, and for the first time her answer wasn't immediate or structured. It was hesitant, almost uncertain, as if she didn't have a prepared response for that part. And after a brief pause she admitted that she thought I would say no, that I would delay the decision, that I would question things in a way that might cause her to lose the opportunity, and while that explanation might sound reasonable on the surface, it revealed something deeper. That she didn't trust my judgment in that moment, or more accurately, she didn't want to be limited by it. She wanted control over the outcome without interference, and to achieve that she chose to remove me from the process entirely while still using my identity to make it happen. That was the moment where the situation shifted again, because it was no longer just about what she did. It was about how she saw me, not as someone to involve in decisions, but as a resource to be used when necessary. And that perception changed everything, because trust isn't just about honesty. It's about intention. It's about believing that someone values your role in their decisions. And what I was realizing in that moment was that my role had been reduced to something functional, something she could access when needed, but not necessarily respect in the process. And that realization carried a different kind of weight, one that went beyond financial consequences and moved into something more personal, something that couldn't be resolved through logic or explanation alone. As I stood there listening to her, I began to understand that confronting the action itself was only part of what needed to happen, because even if the house could be transferred, even if the financial situation could be corrected, the underlying issue would remain. The fact that she made a decision that crossed a line without hesitation, and that she did so with confidence in her ability to manage the outcome, and that confidence suggested that this wasn't a one-time action. It was a reflection of how she approached control, how she viewed limits, and how she justified crossing them when it served her purpose. And that realization made it clear that this situation wasn't just something to resolve. It was something to understand deeply before deciding what happens next. I told her to walk me through everything step by step. Not because I needed the details anymore, but because I needed to hear how she framed them, how she justified each decision in her own mind, and as she spoke, describing how she gathered documents, how she completed forms, how she handled calls and confirmations. There was a consistency in her tone that stood out. She wasn't describing something chaotic or stressful. She was describing something controlled, something she felt confident, managing from start to finish, and that competence was what made the situation feel even more unsettling. Because it meant she never truly believed this would fail, she never expected to be stopped, and she never considered that the process itself was the problem. When she finished explaining, there was another silence, but this one felt different from the first because now everything was clear. There were no missing pieces, no unanswered questions, just a complete picture of what had happened and how it had been done. And in that clarity came a realization that was difficult to ignore. This situation wasn't just about correcting a mistake or reversing a decision. It was about addressing a mindset, a way of thinking that allowed this to happen in the first place, and that made the next step far more complicated than simply deciding what to do with the house or the bank, because now the focus wasn't just on the action. It was on the person behind it and the reasoning that led to it. I looked at her and realized that whatever came next would define more than just this situation. It would define the boundaries of our relationship moving forward, because once a line like this is crossed, it doesn't simply reset it, changes the structure of trust entirely. And the question wasn't just whether I could fix what had been done, it was whether I could trust that it wouldn't happen again in a different form. And that question didn't have an immediate answer. It required time, reflection, and a decision that went beyond logic, because in the end, this wasn't just about a house or a bank call. It was about understanding how far someone is willing to go when they believe they can control the outcome, and whether that belief can ever truly be undone. The conversation didn't end with her explanation, because while her version of events filled in the gaps, it didn't remove the consequences that were already set in motion, and that became clear the moment my phone rang again. The same bank, the same calm tone. But this time the purpose of the call had shifted. It was no longer about confirmation. It was about review, because large transactions don't just disappear once completed. They get analyzed, audited, and sometimes questioned after the fact. And the representative informed me that due to the size of the mortgage and certain internal protocols, the account had been flagged for a secondary verification process, which meant this situation was no longer contained between me and her. It was expanding into something official. Something that would require answers beyond personal explanations, and in that moment I realized that what felt like a private issue was about to become a formal investigation. As I listened to the details of what the bank required, I understood that the system that had allowed everything to pass smoothly in the beginning was now shifting into a different mode, one that didn't rely on automated trust, but on human scrutiny, where patterns are re-examined, where inconsistencies are searched for, and where even small irregularities can trigger larger concerns. And that's when the real pressure began to build, because while the process had been executed perfectly from her side, it was never designed to withstand this level of attention after the fact, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about proving whether the transaction was authorized. It was about explaining how it happened in the first place, and that explanation would have to make sense not just to me, but to people who were trained to detect manipulation. I relayed the situation to her, not to scare her, but because she needed to understand the reality of what was coming, and for the first time since this began, I saw genuine concern in her reaction, not the controlled composure she had maintained earlier, but something more uncertain, more reactive. As if the idea of external scrutiny introduced a variable she hadn't fully accounted for, and that moment revealed something important she had planned, for the execution she had planned, for the possibility of confrontation, but she hadn't fully planned for institutional review, for a process that doesn't rely on emotion or personal reasoning. And that's where the situation began to shift from controlled to unstable, because systems like this don't respond to explanations, they respond to evidence, and right now the evidence pointed directly at me. There was a narrow window to respond before the situation escalated further, and that window required a decision that wasn't simple because every option carried its own consequences. Admitting that the transaction was unauthorized would immediately trigger a deeper investigation, one that could involve legal implications, while attempting to justify or validate it would mean accepting responsibility for something I didn't do, and neither path offered a clean resolution, which is what made this situation so complex. It wasn't just about correcting an action. It was about choosing how that correction would be interpreted by a system that doesn't consider personal context, only factual consistency, and that's when I realized that this wasn't just a test of what had happened, it was a test of how it would be handled under pressure. I asked her one more time if there was anything she hadn't told me, anything that could become a problem if discovered later, and the hesitation in her response was enough to confirm that there were still details missing, small ones perhaps. But in situations like this, small details can become significant when placed under scrutiny, and as she slowly admitted that she had handled certain verification calls herself, responding as if she were me, it became clear that the situation had crossed into a territory that couldn't simply be explained away as a misunderstanding or an internal family matter, because now there was a clear element of impersonation involved, something that institutions take seriously regardless of intent. And that realization added a new layer of tension that neither of us could ignore anymore. Time started to feel compressed because every passing hour increased the likelihood of the situation expanding beyond our control, and I could see the shift in her mindset as well. The confidence she had earlier was now mixed with uncertainty. Because the situation was no longer something she could manage independently, it required coordination, honesty, and a willingness to face outcomes that might not be favorable, and that's where the emotional weight of the situation began to merge with the practical consequences. Because now it wasn't just about what she did, it was about what would happen to both of us as a result, and that shared consequence created a tension that was different from the initial shock. It was heavier, more grounded, and far more difficult to navigate. I made the decision to handle the communication with the bank directly, not to protect her actions, but to control how the situation was presented, because once a narrative is established in systems like this, it becomes difficult to change. And the way information is delivered can influence how it is interpreted. So I prepared myself to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that the transaction involved internal miscommunication, and that I needed time to clarify certain details. Not as a final answer, but as a way to slow down the process and create space to think. And while that approach didn't resolve anything immediately, it prevented the situation from escalating too quickly, which was the only advantage available at that moment. But even as I spoke to the bank and managed to delay the immediate pressure, I knew this wasn't a solution. It was a temporary pause, and pauses don't remove consequences. They only postpone them, and that understanding sat heavily in the background of everything that followed. Because no matter how carefully this was handled, the core issue remained unchanged. A transaction had been completed under my identity, without my direct authorization, and that fact couldn't be erased, only explained, and explanations, especially in systems built on verification and accountability, are not always enough to prevent outcomes that follow a strict process. As the day came to an end, the situation felt very different from where it started. What began as a confusing phone call had evolved into something layered, complex, and deeply personal, involving not just financial risk, but questions of trust, control, and responsibility. And as I looked at her, I realized that this was no longer about a single decision or a single mistake. It was about the chain of choices that led here and the consequences that would follow, and for the first time, the reality of those consequences felt unavoidable, not immediate, but inevitable, waiting just beyond the temporary calm we had managed to create. That night didn't bring clarity. It brought silence, and sometimes silence is more dangerous than chaos because it gives space for thoughts to grow without interruption. And as I sat there going over everything that had happened, one detail kept repeating in my mind: not the house, not the bank, but the level of precision she had used to execute everything, because actions like this don't just come from opportunity, they come from preparation, from observation, over time, from understanding systems and people well enough to predict outcomes. And that realization led me to a question I hadn't fully asked yet. How long had she been capable of doing this? Not just in theory, but in practice, because this didn't feel like a first attempt. It felt like something that had been rehearsed mentally many times before it was actually done. And that thought shifted the entire situation into something darker, something that wasn't just about a single decision, but about a pattern that might exist beneath the surface. The next morning, I started reviewing my own records. Not because the bank asked me to, but because I needed to understand how much of my information had been accessible over time, and what I found wasn't shocking in isolation, but became concerning when viewed as a whole, documents shared for convenience, identification copies given for routine matters. Small pieces of information passed casually without a second thought. All of it seemed harmless when it happened, but together it formed a complete profile, one that could be used to navigate systems with surprising ease, and that's when the realization hit me harder than anything before. This wasn't about her breaking into my identity. It was about me unknowingly building a version of it outside my control, piece by piece, without ever considering how it might be used. When I confronted her again this time, the tone was different. Not because I was angrier, but because I was looking for something deeper than explanations. I was looking for honesty without structure, without preparation, and I asked her directly if this was the first time she had used my information in this way. And the pause that followed felt longer than any answer, because hesitation reveals what words try to hide, and when she finally responded, it wasn't a clear denial, it was a careful statement saying that this was the first major action, and that single word changed everything. Because it implied there had been smaller ones, actions that didn't seem significant at the time, things that didn't get noticed, and that realization turned this from an isolated incident into part of a larger pattern. That was the moment the situation crossed into something far more serious. Because patterns don't just represent past actions, they suggest future behavior, and if this wasn't the first time, then it raised a question that was difficult to ignore. What else had been done that I didn't know about? What other decisions had been made using my identity without my awareness? And that uncertainty created a different kind of tension, one that wasn't tied to a single event, but to the possibility of multiple unknowns, each carrying its own consequences. And that's when I understood that resolving this situation wasn't just about dealing with the house or the bank. It was about uncovering the full extent of what had already happened. At the same time, the bank's review process continued in the background, and the tone of their communication began to shift, subtly becoming more detailed, more specific, asking for clarifications that went beyond surface-level confirmation, and while they didn't accuse anything directly, the nature of their questions made it clear that they were looking deeper, analyzing not just the transaction, but the behavior around it. And that's where the pressure began to build again, because systems like this don't rely on assumptions, they rely on patterns, and if enough inconsistencies appear, they don't just stop at questioning, they escalate, and that possibility was no longer distant. It was becoming increasingly real with every interaction. She started to feel it too, the weight of what was unfolding, and for the first time her confidence seemed to break in a way that wasn't controlled, because now the situation wasn't something she could manage through planning or explanation. It was something external. Something governed by rules and processes that don't adjust based on personal context, and that shift created a different kind of vulnerability, one that came not from being caught, but from realizing that control had been lost. And as I watched that change in her, I understood that this was the turning point, the moment where the situation moved from something contained within our relationship to something that could have consequences beyond it. I asked her one final question that I had been avoiding until now. Not because I didn't want the answer, but because I knew it would change everything once spoken. I asked her if she ever thought about what would happen if this was discovered, not just by me, but by the system itself, and her answer was quiet, almost uncertain. She said she believed she could handle it. That she would explain it, fix it, manage it somehow, and that response revealed the core issue behind everything. It wasn't just the action, it was the belief that outcomes could always be controlled after the fact, that consequences were negotiable, and that systems, like people, could be convinced to overlook what had already been done. But reality doesn't always work that way, especially when systems are involved that are designed to remove emotion from decision-making, and that's what made this situation so critical, because no matter how it was explained, the facts would remain unchanged. A transaction had been completed under my identity without direct authorization. Verification steps had been handled in a way that didn't match the actual account holder, and those facts exist independently of intention, independently of reasoning. And that's where the real danger lies. Not in what people mean to do, but in what the system can prove they did. As everything began to settle into place, one truth became impossible to ignore. This situation was never just about a house, it was about control. About how far someone is willing to go when they believe they understand the system well enough to navigate it without consequences, and about what happens when that belief meets a reality that doesn't adjust to intention and standing there in that moment. I realized that whatever happened next wouldn't just resolve this situation. It would define something much larger, not just for her, but for both of us, because once a line like this is crossed, the outcome is never just about fixing the problem. It's about facing what the problem reveals. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers, slow and controlled at first, almost as if the situation itself was unfolding carefully to reveal its full impact over time, and the first sign of that came through the bank's next communication, where the tone had shifted from inquiry to concern, not direct accusation, but something closer to formal attention, requesting additional documentation, asking for clarification on specific steps in the transaction process, and while nothing was stated outright, the direction was clear. They were no longer verifying the action, they were analyzing it, breaking it down into parts to understand how it aligned with standard behavior, and that shift marked the beginning of a phase where explanations would no longer be enough on their own. They would need to be supported by consistency, something that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain given how the situation had unfolded. At the same time, the financial reality of the decision began to surface, because regardless of how the situation was handled legally or procedurally, the mortgage itself still existed. Payments were scheduled, obligations were active, and the property was tied directly to my financial identity, which meant that even while the investigation was ongoing, the practical side of the situation didn't pause. It continued moving forward, creating pressure from a different direction, one that didn't wait for explanations or outcomes. And that's when I realized that this wasn't just about resolving a problem, it was about managing its ongoing impact while the resolution was still uncertain. Balancing immediate responsibilities with long-term consequences in a way that required constant attention and careful decision-making. She felt it too, not just the emotional weight of what had happened, but the reality of what it meant moving forward. Because now every part of the situation had shifted from something abstract into something tangible, something that affected daily life, future plans, and the stability of everything around it, and for the first time the conversation between us changed from explanation to acknowledgement. Not of the action itself, but of its consequences, because once the situation reached this point, there was no way to return to how things were, before no way to separate what had happened from what would follow, and that understanding created a different kind of tension. One that wasn't driven by conflict, but by the recognition that both of us were now dealing with something that couldn't be undone. The emotional impact didn't come through dramatic moments or visible breakdowns. It showed itself in quieter ways, in pauses during conversations, in the way trust was no longer assumed, but questioned internally even when nothing was being said out loud, because once trust is disrupted at this level, it doesn't simply disappear. It changes, form becoming something that requires effort to rebuild something that can't be taken for granted again. And that shift affected everything, not just how we spoke to each other, but how we interpreted actions, decisions, even silence, because now every interaction carried an awareness of what had already happened and the possibility of what could happen again. The bank process continued. moving steadily forward, and while it didn't escalate into something immediate or extreme, it maintained a level of scrutiny that made it clear the situation was still active, still under observation, and that ongoing attention created a constant pressure in the background. Because even without direct confrontation, the possibility of escalation remained dependent on how the information was interpreted and whether any inconsistencies were identified, and that uncertainty made it difficult to settle into any sense of resolution because the outcome was still undefined. Still dependent on factors that were not entirely within our control. Financially, adjustments had to be made, decisions that would not have existed if this situation had never occurred. Reallocating resources, reconsidering priorities, and managing commitments that were never planned in the first place, and while these changes were manageable in isolation, together they created a noticeable shift, one that extended beyond numbers into lifestyle, into how future decisions would be approached, and that's where the long-term impact began to take shape. Not as a single event, but as a series of ongoing effects that would influence how things move forward from this point. For her, the realization of what had been done and what it meant seemed to settle in, gradually, not through confrontation, but through experience. Through seeing how each part of the situation unfolded, and how each consequence connected back to the original decision, and that process of realization carried its own weight, because understanding something after the fact is very different from anticipating it beforehand. And in that difference lies a kind of awareness that can't be forced. It has to be experienced, and as that awareness grew, so did the recognition that control is not the same as understanding. And that confidence in managing outcomes does not guarantee the ability to handle them once they fully emerge. Looking at everything as it stood, one truth became clear in a way that couldn't be ignored or minimized. This situation was never just about a house. It was about the intersection of trust, control, and consequence, about how decisions made with confidence can create outcomes that extend far beyond their original intention, and about how systems, whether personal or institutional, respond not to what people mean to do, but to what they actually do. And that distinction is what ultimately defines the outcome, because intention can be explained, but actions are what remain. In the end, there wasn't a single moment where everything resolved, no clear point where the situation shifted from problem to closure instead. It settled into something more complex, a new understanding of boundaries of responsibility and of how easily those boundaries can be crossed when confidence outweighs caution, and that understanding didn't erase what had happened. It didn't restore things to their original state. But it did create something else, a perspective that would influence every decision moving forward, not just for her, but for me as well, because once you experience something like this, you don't just move past it. You carry it with you in a way that changes how you see everything that comes after. What makes this story unsettling isn't just what happened. It's how easily it could have happened again without that single phone call, because nothing about the system failed in an obvious way. Nothing broke loudly enough to raise alarms in the moment. Everything worked exactly as it was supposed to. And that's what makes it dangerous, because when a system functions smoothly, people stop questioning it. They trust the process. They assume that checks and balances are always enough. But this situation proved something different. It showed that access familiarity and confidence can quietly override safeguards without triggering immediate consequences. And that realization changes how you see not just financial systems, but every structure built on trust. Even now, when I think back to that moment, the call itself feels almost insignificant compared to what it revealed, because it wasn't just a notification, it was an interruption, a break in a sequence that would have otherwise continued unnoticed. And that's what lingers the most, not the decision that was made, but the fact that, without that interruption, the outcome would have been accepted as normal, processed, as legitimate, and integrated into reality without ever being questioned. And that raises a deeper concern, one that goes beyond this situation. How many other decisions in how many other systems move forward every day simply because no one stops to verify them at the right time? The relationship between us didn't end, but it didn't return to what it was, either, because some experiences don't create distance. They create awareness, a constant. Quiet awareness that changes how trust is formed and maintained, and that awareness doesn't disappear. It becomes part of every interaction, shaping decisions in ways that aren't always visible, but are always present, and while time may reduce the intensity of what happened, it doesn't remove the understanding that came from it, because once you've seen how easily boundaries can shift you, don't forget it. You adjust to it. And maybe that's the real takeaway from all of this. Not the financial impact, not the legal risk, not even the emotional tension, but the understanding that control is often an illusion, especially in systems where multiple layers of access exist, because people tend to believe that ownership equals authority, that identity equals security. But in reality, those things depend on how they are managed, how they are protected, and how they are verified, and when those elements are taken for granted even briefly, the consequences don't always appear immediately, but they are already in motion, because, in the end, this wasn't just about a house, or a decision, or even a mistake. It was about a line that was crossed quietly, confidently, and almost perfectly, a line that only became visible when it was already too late. The most dangerous betrayals aren't loud, they're executed flawlessly. So here's the question you don't hear often enough. If someone had access to everything you've ever shared, your name, your trust, your identity, would you even know before it was too late?